Hello, it's Malcolm Archer here, and just want to talk to you today a little bit about composing a hymn tune. People often ask me, how do you start composing? It's a really difficult question to answer, actually. Most of my composing starts with finding some good words and then improvising until I get some ideas that I like. But several people have also said to me, could you tell us how to write a hymn tune? And where would you start? What would the process be? Of course, writing a hymn tune is very dependent on finding the right text and finding a set of words that really inspire you and may even suggest a melody to you. I must admit that one of my favourite hymn writers was Timothy Dudley Smith, who passed away very recently. I always found that his words were very easy to set to music. I think it's partly because he always started with a well-known tune in his mind before he worked out the meter and what he was going to say in the text. But obviously finding good words is important. Maybe finding some words that don't have a well-known tune already associated to them. Or indeed, if you know a good wordsmith, finding somebody who can write some words for you. That's ideal, because then you're creating a new text and new music. So we find the words that we like. Where do we go from there? Key is very important. We don't want to take the congregation too high. I went to a service recently and found myself singing top E's. And these days I find top notes much more difficult to get. Even a D is quite a high note in my baritone voice. So it's easier for ladies to get high notes than for men to get high notes. So bearing that in mind, picking a good key is important. D major is fine. That would take you up to a D. E flat major would be okay. What you don't want is repeated high notes. What you really want is a high note towards the end so that the congregation know it's coming and they can really work up to getting that note confidently. So maybe D major, maybe E flat major. Of course, it doesn't have to be major, it could be a minor key, and that depends very much on the mood of the words. If it's a more penitential hymn, you probably want a minor key, but if it's uplifting and positive words, then you want a major key. Where do we go from there? I often think writing a hymn tune is a little bit like going on a car journey. So when we set off on our car journey, we begin by going down roads that we know very well, our local streets and our local roads. But then maybe it's going to take us through some countryside that we haven't been through before. Interesting buildings, beautiful views to look at, surprises, things that we don't know about. And we need to think where the journey is going. So what's the destination? Is the destination going to be getting back home again? A little bit like going to the supermarket. Or is the destination going to be arriving at a nice pub and having a good lunch? So that's your destination. That's probably going to come about 2/3 of the way through the hymn tune. After that, your journey home is probably going to be much quicker, because we don't necessarily want the journey home to be as interesting as getting to the pub. So we're probably going to take a shorter route that we know well along familiar roads that's going to bring us home again rather quickly. So let's imagine our hymn tune is like a car journey. We need to set out. We could set out from the tonic. Let's pick D major. And I hasten to add, I'm improvising all this, so I don't quite know what's going to come out. But let's start in D major and see what works. That's okay. Sounds a little bit like another tune, but that's all right. We could fix that later. I rather prefer a tune to start on the 3rd of the scale, rather than on the tonic, because I think starting on the third gives you more interesting possibilities. So let's start on the third, see where it takes us. That's better. It fits nicer with which we already had. So we've got our next phrase needs to be an answering phrase which complements that one, but obviously slightly different. It's going to take us to the dominant, probably, but only a half close in the dominant. So we've got maybe I could do something more interesting with the harmony there, I think. That's nice. That D sharp just adds a bit of colour, doesn't it? And then we could have a suspension at the cadence. So what have we got? We've got where do we go from there? Well, I think our next phrase needs to mirror the first phrase, but not exactly, because it would be very boring to just repeat the first phrase again. So why don't we start off with the first bit of the first phrase, but then take it in a slightly different direction. So let's just play, if I can remember how it goes. So we're going to do the same thing as we'd started, but now we're going to go in a different direction. That's taken us to F sharp minor. That's quite good, because that's a sort of almost a natural link to the dominant, which is going to be our halfway point. So what have we got? We got to the halfway point now. This is the point in the journey where we're heading towards the pub, but there's still some more interesting countryside to see. So we're going to go through some slightly different keys. We've ended up in A major, the dominant. What I want to do now is to launch us off in A minor, which is immediately going to set us on a slightly different road. Quite happy with that. It's just given us a slightly different flavour to the harmony, a sort of warmth to the harmony, but it's also just taken us on a slightly different route. So let's see if I can remember all that. I'm going to play it fast so I don't forget. We're at the pub now. We've had a very nice 3-course lunch and a pint of Guinness Zero because we're driving. And we've thoroughly enjoyed that, but it's time to go home. So we want to get home by a faster route. Now this is where our high note comes in, because it's in the last phrase that we can take the congregation up to that high note. And because they know it's coming, they'll be happy to gird up their loins and make sure that note comes out cleanly. Then what? How about this? So at the end I could have gone, I sort of prefer the first version because that dotted note on the E just gives you a greater sense of finality. It also strengthens the harmony there. So that suspension in thirds really grinds. So there it is. Can I remember it all? That's the thing. I'm going to play it fast, see if I can. So there it is, a hymn tune, like a car journey. Now, of course, you have to remember that every car journey these days involves roadworks along the way and takes you on a diversion. And those roadworks in composing a hymn tune are called consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves. And somehow we have to avoid them. So we take a diversion. It might be altering one note, could be altering a couple of notes, but ideally we don't really want to be writing parallel intervals. Having said that, Stanford in Engelberg, one of my favourite hymn tunes, does write a parallel. I'm not going to tell you where it is. And of course, we take our diversion on the road journey, and that diversion brings us to more roadworks because one council isn't talking to the other council. But that's a different issue. So having composed our hymn tune, all good hymn tunes need to have a name, like Middleton Stony, or it could be named after your favourite beer. I once named a hymn tune Adnams. Managed to get a whole boot full of free bottles of Adnams from the brewery because I talked about it on BBC Songs of Praise. That was a nice surprise. So look, what are we going to call our hymn tune? Well, every hymn tune is a mixture of inspiration and a little bit of wizardry. So maybe we should call it Hogwarts. No, there could be copyright issues with that. Why don't we just call it social media? Anyway, there we are. Some ideas about writing a hymn tune. It obviously assumes a reasonably good knowledge of harmony and keyboard harmony, but I hope it just gives you some pointers to encourage you to write your own. Happy composing.